Joining us now is Miles Garrett, a sports reporter on Fox Atlanta 5. Just so you know, he's got all the info related to everything about A-Town. You can check him out on Twitter at Miles Garrett TV. And as he has put in his bio, he's probably not the Miles Garrett you're looking for, but according to some stuff that he's dropped, he often gets mistaken for being that Miles Garrett. How's it going? Thanks so much for being on here today.
Doing good, man. How are you?
I am doing well. All right, let's just kind of get right into this thing, because ultimately I think if we look at this thing, I mean, it is a really intriguing offseason. You've got Atlanta. They have the 8th overall pick. The Bears are picking at 9th overall. I mean, you and I, I'm sure, are getting tired of a lot of the quarterback talk that's taking place between both fan bases. I mean, it's intriguing in a sense, but it's kind of like we just want this thing to be over with because, quite frankly, as reporters, we too are so tired of the anticipation. But let's get right into it with Raheem Morris. I mean, he's back in town. He's spent about 6 to 7 years in Atlanta. What's the vibe around Raheem returning to Atlanta and getting a second shot at being the head coach for a team?
Yeah, admittedly, at first it was kind of startling, I think, for a lot of Falcons fans and maybe even reporters alike, just because of the chatter this offseason around, the Falcons are big game hunting. They're deep in talks with Bill Belichick, with Jim Harbaugh, all these big name guys. And then you end up with a guy who was in your building just, 4 years ago. So because of those, I think that it was maybe slightly, I also apologize, there's a motorcycle right next to me here. But no, because of that, I think it was a little bit surprising, but it's been universally loved, I think, by a lot of players and fellow head coaches alike in regards to Raheem Morris because of his likability with players, his ability to connect to them, and also his familiarity with Atlanta. He talked about how it's his 3rd time now being hired by Rich McKay, who was the president of the Falcons formerly. So he has a connection there with the Buccaneers and the Falcons, obviously. But yeah, no, it's funny. I talked to Mohamed Sanu just a day before Raheem was hired and asking him, hey, who do you want to be the Falcons head coach? And without hesitation, he said Raheem Morris, just because of, what he's done in Atlanta as a positions coach. And I think really he received a lot of his growth up there in LA with Sean McVay kind of learning under him. And if you really look at that coaching tree that was in Washington back in 2013, he was a part of that group. With Sean McVay, with Kyle Shanahan, Mike McDaniel, Bobby Slowick, all those big-time names who have now become basically the hottest coaching candidates or head coaches basically out there right now. He was a part of that group. So I think there is something to that, and the players definitely are big fans of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's intriguing, and oftentimes we kind of hear the trend where defensive-minded head coaches love to have veteran quarterbacks. So that's something that, Atlanta's certainly going to have to explore because, yes, they have Desmond Ridder, again, a guy who coming out of the draft a couple of years ago, a lot of people were looking at him and as being a low-risk, high-reward type player. But now, there is some uncertainty. I mean, based on the comments that the Falcons have kind of made, right? You've got Raheem, who, again, being a veteran defensive head coach. And you also have Terry Fontenot, who was on one of the radio shows a few weeks ago. He had a couple nice things to say. I mean, what direction do you think the organization goes in here regarding the quarterback position?
Yeah, I think it's definitely not going to be Desmond Ridder. Now, I do think Des will stay on the team. He is still on a rookie deal. There really isn't risk to keep him on the team. Now, starter, I think, is a different story. Based on what I'm hearing, Steve Weish, who's very plugged in to the Falcons beat, said today, and he said it before, it's kind of the vibe we've been getting. Benjamin Albright, another reporter who has mentioned it, but I do think the Falcons address it in the draft, and if not, trade up. I think that's kind of the only situation here where you get a quarterback who I would suppose most analysts would argue, is worth taking that high because, I think you're seeing some conversations surrounding J.J. McCarthy perhaps being a top 10 pick. Some draft experts have kind of predicted him to rise up to that category, but I don't think he's really moving the needle, at least for a lot of fans. I don't think that'll really make them too excited if J.J. McCarthy is in fact the guy. So there's still a lot of time to figure this out. Guys will rise, guys will fall based on what happens at the combine this week, and obviously pro days and all this other stuff. So and of course trades as well. Justin Fields could get dealt, as you very well know. Kirk Cousins may sign somewhere. There's a lot of moving parts here that kind of still need to sort themselves out. But long story short, I do think the Falcons address that position in the draft, and I do think it'll be a trade up.
I mean, it's interesting because I've done probably 5 or 6 of these shows now where I've talked to people that cover other teams, and quite frankly, the vibe that I get is that there's, some of these guys some of these teams in the top 10 that could potentially trade up for quarterbacks. I've heard the Giants, I had a Patriots guy on yesterday who was like, maybe they go ahead and trade back. So it's so fluid at this point. But speaking of Justin Fields, I mean, I don't think, you being a Falcons guy need any introduction to his background. Kind of went to high school in the suburban Atlanta area, really went ahead and committed to the University of Georgia out of high school. I think he said after his, middle of senior year of high school, he was like, hey, I'm signing on with Georgia. But do you think, Justin would be welcomed in Atlanta? And if so, what's a potential trade package looking like? Because it's something where I look at and say, the 8th overall pick is really rich. We've seen guys at ESPN say, hey, that's a possibility. But I also think that if you're Atlanta, you're looking at a guy who's been up and down. Yeah, he's a hometown kid, but you're probably willing to, fork over your 2nd and 3rd for him. I would even say like a 2nd and a 4th.
Yeah, no, the first part of your question, I think Justin Fields would definitely be welcome here in Atlanta. The fan base certainly would be ecstatic to have him. As someone who's pretty plugged into the fan base here in Atlanta, they are very big fans of having that option of Justin Fields perhaps coming to Atlanta. Now, as far as compensation is concerned, if the Bears get a 1st-round pick for Justin Fields, it's highway robbery, because I don't see any scenario where they get a 1st-round pick for Justin Fields, or even a 2nd-round pick for that matter. I think a 3rd-round pick is the highest you get for him. Some team probably will give a 2nd. I don't think he'll be worth a 2nd just because of what we've seen thus far. Now, he does have high upside. I'll give him that. But at the moment, I don't think, again, this is all based on what I've heard from some experts and analysts. I don't expect a 1st-round pick for Justin Fields. Now, I do, like I said, I think the Bears can, up the price up a little bit because teams are starving for franchise quarterbacks. And Justin Fields, we don't really know what he is right now. You don't know if he's been a byproduct of a poor Bears team the last few years, or whether or not maybe he actually has had some issues kind of finding consistency in that offense, because we've seen time and time again, maybe some of his issues in finding wide open receivers, kind of stepping up in the pocket and kind of being a little patient. It seems like he's kind of trigger happy at times in regards to using his legs. Now, we know that he has the talent. We've seen it at Ohio State. We've seen it at times in Chicago. But it's just a matter of putting it all together, because you do realize at the end of the day, you're going to have to pay Justin too. That contract situation is looming for him. So that's another situation to monitor, because you have that in regards to maybe a potential rookie deal too. If you do decide to take a rookie quarterback, it's going to be a lot cheaper. So these are all things you got to consider when talking about Justin Fields.
Yeah, and realistically, from Atlanta's perspective, given how young of an offensive core that they have, you look at that core on paper, and I think you don't really need any sort of introduction to it, because you have 3 top 10 picks at wide receiver, tight end, as well as running back. It's interesting to me, because if you are Terry Fontenot, you are Ryan Pace, who, again, the guy that drafted Justin Fields, you're going to look at this. You're Arthur Blank. You're saying, hey, having an NFL quarterback, a guy that's got 3 years of solid starting experience under his belt, that's attractive. But also, at the end of the day, we have Drake London. We've got Kyle Pitts. We also have Bijan Robinson. We are looking at a young offensive coordinator in Zach Robinson too, that we quite frankly want to bring in a quarterback that's going to grow with the rest of these guys. And the hard part about Fields is you would basically within 1 calendar year have to make a decision as to whether or not you are paying him. And let's just not forget, in another 2.5 months, you're going to have to make a decision on this 5th-year option.
Yeah, exactly. And, do you want to say, if we talk scenarios here, say Justin doesn't kind of show you what you want to see, and suddenly you're back to square one next. Is it a question of, do we want to take a quarterback again? Are you picking as high as the 8th overall pick? This is the year where you kind of have an opportunity, at least draft-wise, to kind of make that move if you want it for quarterback, because another 7-10 season a losing record, the leash is going to be very, very short for Raheem Morris and Terry Fontenot just because of the roster that they have. As you said, there's a lot of talent already in place. The defense took major strides last year. Jesse Bates, arguably the best safety in the NFL right now. You've got a bunch of talent there. Grady Jarrett, the linebacking core, A.J. Terrell. And, of course, you have on offense. You have all those young guys who are kind of just waiting to have that quarterback. You saw what Kyle Pitts was able to do when he had a Matt Ryan. He broke all these rookie records. Drake London breaking rookie records. Bijan Robinson doing the same thing. So the conversation will basically become, do we want to have this conversation next year? Do you want to risk taking a guy like Justin Fields to basically bet on his upside that you don't really know will come to fruition? Or do you want to take a chance on a rookie? So it's going to be a question that they're going to have to consider, that I'm sure a lot of teams are going to have to consider, whether it's the Falcons or, maybe the Patriots, a lot of different teams who could be potentially interested in Justin Fields.
Yeah, it is this kind of, weird situation to go ahead and monitor. But, everyone wants to talk about quarterback. Everyone says, hey, let's just focus on that. And, when a team has a opening, or I guess, the team has a big need for a quarterback, it's kind of just this, hey, let's just link a quarterback to them, especially if they're picking top 10. But getting away from the quarterback position, right? Let's say they say, hey, we're going to stick with Desmond Ridder. We'll figure out a veteran to kind of come in and push him. I mean, what are some other positions of need Atlanta's targeting with the 8th overall pick? Because I think ultimately, if you look at it from an outsider's perspective, I would go ahead and say, hey, they need a tight end possible. Well, I'm sorry, not a tight end, but a offensive tackle would possibly make sense, or maybe even a pass rusher, or they decide to go ahead and say, hey, let's trade out of 8th overall. Let's trade down, because there's going to be a team like Minnesota that's going to try and move up for a player like Jaden Daniels.
Yeah, no, I mean, well, granted, if Jaden Daniels is available, I don't see any situation Falcons are giving that to Minnesota. But that considered, I do think edge rusher will probably be their top priority, as you said. I think a guy like Dallas Turner, Jared Verse, maybe those types of guys could be available at pick number 8 and would be pretty suitable for what the Falcons are looking for. They've swung and missed on a lot of edge rushers. They still really need one. Their interior defensive line is pretty set. It's the kind of edge rusher issue that's kind of plagued them basically since John Abraham left. You had that one all-pro season out of Vic Beasley, but he kind of went away after that. They've missed on Tack McKinley. They basically haven't really had that true guy to come off the edge since Abraham. So I imagine Dallas Turner could be a guy that would fit the bill. I don't see him being taken ahead of that point. But as you said, you could also look at a guy like Joe Alt out of Notre Dame. He could be another option you could use there to beef up the offensive line. Right now, it's a pretty solid offensive line overall for the Falcons. There might be some conversations about a guy like, maybe Caleb McGarry or some others. But for the most part, it's a pretty solid offensive line. Matthew Bergeron, the former rookie, made big jumps this year, kind of established himself as a starter, as well as Drew Dahlman as a center. Obviously, you have All-Pro and Chris Lindstrom and a Pro Bowler in Jake Matthews. But it's a pretty strong unit. So outside of those two, I don't really see a scenario where they draft a wide receiver, given the fact that they do need a number 2 next to Drake London. They're going to have some contract talks, whether that's with Collins or some other guys. Maybe they sign a T. Higgins. But at this point in time, you might have to consider a wide receiver too. And, whether that, I imagine if you do decide to go that route, you would perhaps trade back.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like, there's a lot of those teams that need a wide receiver. And quite frankly, this is kind of the draft where you can trade back, accumulate some extra picks. Because the meat of this draft, especially for picking in the top 10, is really, the second and third round, as I've kind of said consistently on this podcast all off season. But, a couple more for you here. I mean, when you look at Atlanta and what they are doing this week in Indianapolis, what are some things you're looking for the Falcons to ultimately accomplish when they spend a week in Indy? Because the combine is kind of where the foundation for a lot of what happens in March and April really gets set.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine this is where the conversations are going to be taking place with other teams. This is just like as someone who went there last year and covered this event and kind of got a vibe for kind of how this works and whatnot. I imagine this is where the Falcons are have a lot of their conversations with other teams regarding, potentially trading up, because that seems to be the chatter right now with the Atlanta Falcons, among other teams currently, to move up. The Combine is obviously a great place to do it because all your scouts are there, all your management's there. Obviously, Terry Fontenot is going to be there with Raheem Morris. So I think it's a good spot for those conversations to take place. But outside of that, I mean, you're going to have your basic interviews, your basic Combine stuff where you get acquainted to players. Obviously, that's kind of what it's for. But I think the big elephant in the room will be the fact that I think they're going to have those conversations with the teams to kind of gauge where they can trade up and how they can do it.
Yeah, I mean, and I would not be surprised to see some sort of dialogue take place between the Bears and the Falcons, especially considering the level of familiarity that's there with Justin Fields, Ryan Pace, as well as just, the Bears organization in general. Because if you look at the Bears this offseason, right, they've been very tight-lipped about the entire quarterback situation. They're a wild card. Everyone's kind of waiting to see, okay, what happens when the Bears make the decision? What domino effect is that going to go ahead and have? But last one for you here. We've touched on a lot of the playmakers before, but from your perspective, I mean, where do you think Justin would realistically fit in if the Falcons go ahead and trade for him, in terms of how do you think he would come in and impact this offense? How would we basically, open it up for guys like Drake London and Kyle Pitts?
So the question is how Justin would fit in the offense? Is the question?
Yes.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, I mean, it'd be interesting because Zach Robinson, obviously his play calling, the quarterbacks that he's had in the past don't necessarily kind of match up to what Justin Fields' skill set is. So I do think there will be kind of an adjustment for both parties, because I think Zach Robinson will do his best to play to Justin's strengths, but Justin will also have to adjust to what Zach Robinson's system is. Now, Justin is a guy who has had to adjust with a lot of different offensive coordinators. I think it's part of the reason why he's had some struggles in the past, because there hasn't been any sort of consistency with what he's been coached with. And I do think that's very valuable for especially a young player. Now, that being said, I do think he fits in pretty well just because of the playmakers they have. Justin can obviously extend plays with his legs. And he does have, he really does have a lot of underrated arm talent and, just overall skill as a passer. We've seen it at the collegiate level before. I mean, this is a guy who is basically 1A, 1B with Trevor Lawrence in high school down here in Georgia, and obviously playing at Georgia and then Ohio State. So because of that, I think there's a lot of things to like with him. Any quarterback I think could do pretty well in Atlanta's system. That's why at the beginning of last year, I thought Desmond Ridder would work out. Basically, you don't have to, as long as you don't mess up, it's a pretty good offense right now with all the guys they have, just height-wise, body types, Kyle Pitts and Drake London. These are all really big-bodied guys, and you have two great running backs right now. Obviously, we know what Bijan Robinson can do, but a lot of people sleep on Tyler Algier. This is a guy that rushed for over 1,000 yards, broke the rookie rushing record just 1 year ago. Bijan Robinson was kind of seen as a luxury pick at the time. So to have those guys to kind of fall back on, I think will be great for a guy like Justin Fields, who's kind of trying to resurrect his career a little bit. He doesn't really have to be the superhero, as I think that he's had to be the last couple seasons in Chicago. He can kind of lean back on some of these playmakers. So I think he would fit pretty well. But I do think it's also important to note that, how many times do you see a quarterback kind of thrive in his second stint somewhere where he wasn't thriving before? You don't see it a lot. You see some guys who are successful at one team and then successful at another team, but you don't necessarily see a guy who was drafted by a team do poorly then thrive. And I'm talking quarterbacks, not just different players. I don't think you see that too often. So he definitely doesn't have history on his side, but I wouldn't be surprised to see him thrive because he has so much talent.
Yeah, absolutely. And I totally agree with everything you said right there. It's not realistic for a fourth-year quarterback to kind of go ahead and take that jump, especially when you do get traded to another team and basically have to learn for Justin, what's going to be his, third system in 4 years, regardless of wherever he is. Before we get out of here, where can people follow you on Twitter, keep up to date with everything you're doing with Fox 5 in Atlanta?
Yeah, so I post just about everything on my Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it today, at Miles Garrett TV, Miles with an I. I do most of my stuff on there. I post a lot of my work on YouTube as well. You can look me up there, Miles Garrett. If you dig through all the Miles Garrett defensive end highlights, you'll probably find me in there somewhere. But yeah, that's where I post most of my stuff. And if you have any Atlanta viewers watching this, turn on Channel 5. I'll usually be on for sports. So that's where they can find me.
Absolutely. And thanks so much for being on here. We're going to have to do this again sometime soon, hopefully closer to the season. But yeah, you're welcome on here anytime.
Awesome. Yeah, it was a pleasure to be on. Thanks for having me.